Hello, we're back with another video. Today we're going to be looking at animations, simple animations, and we're going to be using our To-Do app to go through those animations. So what we want to be able to do is right now when we create a new item, we get a new item here. If we add another item, it just pops up. So there's no animation, it just pops up when you come back to the view. It's not really the nicest thing. And once we remove every item, this no items shows up as well here, just pops up with no animation. It's kind of rude almost. So let's do something about it. The first thing we need to do is, instead of using our current list view builder, we're going to swap this around. There's a really nice widget called AnimatedList, which makes this very easy for us. So to do that, first thing we'll do is replace our list view builder here with an AnimatedLists widget. Now this widget has a few different things. Instead of an item count, it has an initial item count. And it needs this because it only cares about this initial length of the list the first time when it renders the list. After that, we will need to tell it that we've added an item to our items list, and that it needs to render an animation to show that new item that's been added. And to do that, it will provide us with an extra item here called animation. We can see that. Sorry about that. Let's look at this. I'm going to delete it so I can see it properly. The error. So build context int widget can be assigned to the parameter time build context int animation double. So this will give us an animation, which we'll call animation here, and we can now use. So since we were using our delete as a dismissible that just slides up once it's deleted, let's do an animation that's similar for adding a new item. And to do that, we'll wrap around our build item widget here with a new widget called a SizeTransition. So there are several different transitions, as you can see here. There's fade transition, size transition, align transition, and a few other things. But we're going to use size because this one would allow us to do exactly what we want, which is to be able to resize it, resize our item, and kind of fade in the same way, or fade that in the same way that we do when we delete it. So let's do exactly that. So SizeTransition saying here that it needs a parameter called size factor. Size factor. So this is where our animation from here comes in. Once I start typing here, you'll see that animation is an object that will provide us with a double. So our size factor is a double, and this will be giving us a double. All this will do is essentially, as the frames per second go forward in our application during the runtime, it will be counting up or down depending on what we tell it on the numbers, on the double numbers. So this will provide our size transition with the size factor it needs to know that it should be running the animation and go from being at the 0 size to the full size and the full height of what we needed. So let's see what this does. I'm going to save this, make sure it's running. Let's click here. I'm going to add a new item. Nothing. Oh, so what's going on here? So it did add a new item because it's rendered the first time once we added the list. So it went from being an empty list to doing the render body instead, the build list view instead. And when that state changed, it rendered our first item, but it didn't render our second item. And that's because we have defined all of this, but we're actually, like I said earlier, this is an animated list and it has an initial item count, and that item count has actually changed, but the animated list doesn't take it into account. It only the first time it's rendered onto the view does it care about this initial item count, and after then we have to tell it. So that's what we're going to do. But to be able to access this list, we need to give it a key, and we're going to declare this key up here. That's GlobalKey, which allows us to access it anywhere. And this needs to be an animated list state. which kind of makes sense because this is an animated list, and when you want to access its state and change what's going on inside. Let's call this the animated list controller, sorry, key, and let's say it is exactly this. So it's instantiated. Okay, animated list key, and now we can come here and say, okay, whoops, sorry about that. Let's go ahead, copy, and here we go. So we've got no errors. Now, when we add a new item to our list, as we usually do by coming here and adding something, we're calling our function down here called add item. Now, here we add it to our actual list, our list of items, but now we want to add it to our animated list. So we're going to access its key. We're going to access its current state, which is what we declared up there, and we're going to say insert item. Now, because we are adding it at the top of the list, because we want it to be the newest item to be visible on the top, then we're going to do exactly that. We're going to tell it we want to add it on index 0. So let's see what happens here. First of all, it's immediately updated the set state, so it changed, but let's restart our whole application so we can see the actual effect of this. I'm going to create a new item. First of all, we have an error. Why do we have an error? This happens because we tried to insert an item, and we did insert an item, but the problem was that the animated list didn't have a state at the moment we inserted the item, because when we did that, it was still rendering our empty list. I'm going to remove this. So we were here, we added an item, we saved it, and we got an error because it's trying to add an item to a state that doesn't exist yet because the list hasn't been rendered, only the empty list view was there. So to fix that, even though it may not feel the most logical, I'm actually going to do just check if our current state is available, if it's not null, and only then add this in. So let's see what happens if I do this. Fully restarted the application, and we no longer have an error. All right, that's one problem solved. Now, this is working. Save. We can see our animation, it's growing. Once we add a new item, it slides down. Looks good. But now let's remove an item. That's okay. That seems fine, but oh, there we go. Now that I try to add a new item, even before I did anything, it immediately told me that there's a range error in our list. So this happens obviously because even though we've been adding these items and saying that our animated list, we're saying to our animated list that it needs a new item to be inserted, we haven't been doing the opposite, which is when we delete to remove an item. So let's do that. Let's just come here. I'm going to copy paste what we've done below. After we delete the item, actually the other way around, before we delete the item, I'm going to come to the state and say remove item at its index. Now you can see here that I am passing the index when I call this function. So if you go up here to where it's being called, I'm not only passing our index, correct this, not only passing our item that we're going to manipulate, but also the index it's in. And I do this so that I can later come here and use it to remove the item from our animated list. Now you can see that there's an error here because it expects a builder. And this builder is because it expects us to want to have an animation on the removal of the item. But because we've decided earlier when we did our application to have a dismiss animation and widget to do our deletion, we don't actually need an animation. So we still need to put in here that we have going to accept a context and an animation. It still expects to be returned some sort of widget. And because we don't want to show anything, we'll just give it a sized box and make sure it's 0 height and 0 width so it doesn't show anything. and we are going to hot restart our application, and let's try this again and see if we still have our problem. Just another more item. Gonna delete one. Gonna try to add a new one. And we don't have a problem anymore. So this is we're not having a problem anymore because not only are we removing it, but also we're not getting an error on when it tries to run an animation, because if we didn't do this, if we try to pass something completely empty, which we could do, if we just did this, we were going to have a problem, as we do straight away. So it's trying to paint something that is not there, and to avoid that, we just need to make sure we actually return a widget, even though it's a completely empty, with no height and no width widget. It's just there to prevent us from having an error, because we don't want to show an animation, because we already have our dismissible widget that takes care of that for us. So we have an animation on our list for when we add items. We don't actually see it on the first time because it's swapping from the other view, but from that moment on, we start getting our animation sliding down. So it looks a little bit nicer. All right. But now we have no animation when we remove all of the items. We just get this pop saying no items. So let's get into a little bit more advanced animation, which is, instead of using a pre-made animated list widget here, we're going to use something different. We're going to use a transition. So we've used the transition already on our animated list, the SizeTransition, but the animation was being given to us by the animated list itself, so we didn't have to worry about controlling the animation in any way. But now for our no items, we're going to do this differently. So first of all, I'm going to declare an animation controller. I'm going to call it empty list controller. And now I can't initialize it up here. I could try, but an animation controller expects this vsync. Now, what is this vsync? Essentially, vsync is to tell our animation that it runs synchronous to the frames per second of our application. So to run our animation, we need a ticker provider. So we do with ticker provider state mixin. So this allows our class to have a way to sync our frames per second with the animation that's running. I don't have very deep information about this. I'd suggest that if you want to learn a bit more about how animations work in Flutter, I can provide you with some links and you can study it yourself. For the purpose of this video, it's just easier to go this way without going into too much detail and getting lost. Now, because we're declaring in our class that it has a ticket provider state mixin that allows us to use animations, I would just need to say this so it knows what to vsync with. But I can't do this because we can't access this can be used before the initialization of the variable. So we're going to use this on our init state, as we've done in other cases. We're going to add here our init state and do it here. Now, on our animation controller, we are going to declare a few more things, not just vsync. Here we'll be able to set the duration of our animation with using duration widget or duration class and defining milliseconds. I'm going to say 200 milliseconds, and that's it. Now, we have our controller, but we haven't said we're going to use it and how we're going to do it. So we're going to wrap our current text widget with a new widget. It's going to be a transition, but a different one. Before we used the SizeTransition, and now we're going to use a fade transition. So we have our child, which we already had, and it needs, as we can see here, it needs an opacity because we're going to be fading in our no items text. So what do? Before we give the animation from our animated list, and now we're going to give it the animation controller that we declared, which is the empty list controller. So there we go, empty list controller. So what happens? We've declared this empty list controller up here. We've instantiated. We said how long it's going to last. It knows which kind of animation it's going to run because we've said it's a fade transition. But because we're doing this animation by hands in a way, we need to say when it goes forward, when it goes backward, if you want to restart it. Because if we just do this and we don't do anything at all, well, first of all, we need to hot restart our application because all the state and these changes we've declared up here haven't been run yet because there are state changes. And we can see we have no text here because our animation hasn't been run. So it's a fade transition and it expects to fade in, but we actually haven't done that. It's actually faded out. So what we should have done is come here in our empty list controller and say, go forward the first time it runs. So let's do exactly that. I'm going to restart this here and we saw a very quick fade in. So now we can see that it faded in and now, well, this won't work for now because if we just add an item and remove it, it's still just going to pop in because we're not doing anything with it. So what we want to do is when we, same way we checked here to refresh our whole state once the list of items is empty, we're going to use the same situation to call on our animation, our empty list animation controller. I want to say that it needs to reset because I want it to be faded out. And once the set state has changed, then I want it to go forward. So let's see what happens now. I'm going to add a new item and I'm going to remove a new item. Oh, there we go. Nice animation. Let's do it again. Add another one. Remove, remove, and it fades in. So there you go. We've got a couple of animations. We've got an animation once we add items. Here we go. And another one. And when we remove all the items, we get a nice animation saying we have no items anymore. So that's about it. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.